Story time, folks. Let me tell you about my life in this small village where everyone knows everyone. It's the kind of place where you can't sneeze without your neighbor offering you a tissue. I'm the village carpenter, and let me tell you, there's never a dull moment around here. My workshop sits right next to my house, and I spend my days crafting furniture and fixing anything wooden that needs a little love. The smell of sawdust is like perfume to me, and the sound of my tools is my favorite music. My wife, well, she's something else. Always by my side, bringing me lunch when I forget to eat, which is often, and making our house feel like a real home. At least, that's what I thought. Now, right across the street lives my good friend, the village teacher. He's got a heart of gold. That one, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand. His wife is a real social butterfly. You can hear her laugh from a mile away. They seemed like the perfect couple, hosting dinner parties and organizing village events. Every evening after a long day of work, the four of us would often sit on my porch, sipping homemade lemonade and watching the sunset. We'd share stories, laugh about the day's events, and plan for the future. It felt like we had it all figured out, you know? Little did I know, as I sat there feeling content with my simple life, that everything was about to change. The quiet evenings, the friendly chats, the sense of trust and community, it was all going to be turned upside down. But that's how life goes, isn't it? Just when you think you've got it all worked out, life throws you a curveball. And let me tell you, the curveball heading our way was going to shake our little village to its core. As I went to bed that night, the sound of my wife's steady breathing beside me, I had no idea that tomorrow would be the day my world would start to crumble. But that's a story for another time. For now, it's time for bed. After all, every good bedtime story needs a little suspense, right? Let me tell you, that day started like any other. I woke up early, kissed my wife goodbye, and headed to my workshop. But something tugged at me. Our attic needed cleaning, and I decided to tackle it during my lunch break. Little did I know, this simple chore would turn my world upside down. As I rummaged through old boxes, I found a dusty, leather-bound book, my wife's diary from her college days. I know I shouldn't have, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, and suddenly it was like I'd been dunked in ice-cold water. Page after page detailed wild parties, drinking, and my heart nearly stopped, multiple intimate encounters with guys I knew. My hands shook as I read. This couldn't be my wife, could it? The devoted woman I thought I knew? When she came home that evening, I confronted her. My voice trembled as I held up the diary. "What's this?" I asked. Her face went pale, then she broke down crying, admitting everything but swearing she'd changed. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. But that wasn't the end of the story time surprises. The next day, as I sat on my porch, lost in thought, I saw my teacher friend looking distressed. He confided in me that his wife had been acting strange lately, always rushing off with vague excuses. A few days later, he showed up at my door, his eyes red and puffy. In a shaky voice, he told me he'd followed his wife that afternoon. Guess where she went? Straight to the village baker's house, my friend's best friend. When he confronted them, his wife admitted to the affair, but had the nerve to say she wanted to continue it. As we sat there, two broken men, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the end of our simple, happy lives? How could we ever trust again? The once peaceful village now felt like a den of secrets and lies. That night, as I lay in bed, miles apart from my wife, despite her being right next to me, I realized this wasn't just a bedtime story anymore. This was real life, with all its messy, painful complications. And I had no idea how this story would end. You know how they say news travels fast in a small town? Well, let me tell you, it's true. Before I knew it, our whole village was buzzing with gossip about me and the teacher. It was like living in a fishbowl, with everyone watching and whispering. I couldn't go to the market without feeling eyes on me. Some folks would pat me on the back, saying things like, "You're better off without her," while others would give me cold looks, like I was the bad guy for not forgiving my wife right away. The teacher had it just as bad. People were taking sides, and our once friendly village turned into a battleground of opinions. The worst part? I couldn't even find peace in my own home. Every time I looked at my wife, all I could see were the pages of that diary. Trust? Gone. Just like that. And then a thought hit me like a ton of bricks. What about our kid? Was I even the father? The doubt ate at me day and night. I tried to push through to make things work, but it was like trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces. In the end, I did something I never thought I'd do. I filed for divorce. My hands shook as I signed the papers, but I couldn't see any other way out. When I told my wife, she broke down. She begged and pleaded, swearing she wasn't that college girl anymore. "I've changed," she kept saying, tears streaming down her face. "Please, give me another chance." But how could I? The trust was broken, and I didn't know if it could ever be fixed. Every night became a lonely bedtime story, with me tossing and turning, wondering how my life had turned into such a mess. The village that once felt like a warm, cozy blanket now felt suffocating. Everywhere I went, I could hear the whispers, see the pointing fingers. "Did you hear about the carpenter?" they'd say. "His wife, and now he's leaving her." It was like living in a bad dream, one I couldn't wake up from. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun set on another day in this changed village, I couldn't help but wonder, was this really the end of my story? Or was there more to come? All I knew was that this was one bedtime story I never wanted to tell my kid, if they were even mine. The thought made my heart ache all over again. As I was dealing with my own mess, I couldn't help but notice my friend, the teacher, falling apart. We'd meet sometimes, two broken men trying to make sense of our shattered lives. One day, he came to me, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You won't believe what they proposed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His wife and the baker had suggested a polyamorous relationship. Can you imagine? The poor guy was torn between his love for his wife and the pain of her betrayal. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the battle between his heart and his head. As the days went by, I saw less and less of him. He stopped coming to village gatherings, stopped teaching at the school. It was like he'd become a ghost, haunting his own life. I wanted to help, but how could I, when I was barely keeping it together myself? Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, old Margaret, the village elder, stepped in. Now, Margaret's not one to meddle, so when she called for a meeting with both couples and the baker, we knew it was serious. There we were, all of us sitting in Margaret's cozy living room, the air thick with tension. My wife fidgeting nervously, the teacher looking like he wanted to disappear, his wife and the baker awkwardly avoiding everyone's eyes, and me wondering how this became my life. Margaret looked at each of us, her wise old eyes full of concern. "My dears," she began, her voice soft but firm, "it's time we talked." She told us a story, an old folktale about a village much like ours. It was a tale of secrets and lies, of betrayal and forgiveness. As she spoke, I felt something shift in the room. It was like we were all holding our breath, hanging on to her every word. "Secrets," Margaret said, "are like poison. They eat away at us, at our relationships, at our very souls." She paused, looking at each of us in turn. "But forgiveness, true forgiveness, can be the antidote." As I sat there, listening to this bedtime story for adults, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, hurt, confusion, but also a tiny spark of something else. Hope, maybe? I glanced at my wife, saw the tears in her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a twinge of something other than betrayal. Margaret's story ended, but our story? Well, that was far from over. As we left her house that evening, the air felt different. The weight of secrets had been lifted, but now we faced something even more daunting: the prospect of forgiveness and healing. I went to bed that night with my mind racing. Could I forgive? Could we heal? Or was this just another chapter in a story that was destined for a sad ending? As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that this was one bedtime story that didn't have a clear moral, at least not yet. After Margaret's story, something changed in our little group. It was like a dam had broken, and suddenly everyone started talking, really talking. My wife, her voice shaking, started to share things I'd never known. She told us about her childhood, about the pain and trauma she'd kept hidden all these years, how she'd felt worthless, unloved, and how her wild behavior in college was her way of trying to feel something, anything. As I listened, I felt a mix of emotions: anger at what she'd been through, sadness that she'd never told me, and a surprising twinge of understanding. Then the teacher's wife spoke up. She talked about feeling invisible, how the teacher's dedication to his students left her feeling neglected. "I know it doesn't excuse what I did," she said, tears in her eyes, "but I felt so alone." The teacher looked shocked, like he was seeing his wife for the first time. As we all sat there absorbing these revelations, I realized how little we really knew about each other, even after all these years. It was like we were characters in a bedtime story, finally revealing our true selves. The next few days were a whirlwind. Word of our meeting with Margaret spread, and suddenly the whole village rallied around us. It was amazing to see. The same people who'd been whispering behind our backs were now offering support and understanding. They organized counseling sessions with a therapist from the next town over. I was skeptical at first. I mean, how could talking about our feelings fix this mess? But I went. We all did. And you know what? It helped. It wasn't easy, mind you. There were days when I wanted to give up, when the pain and betrayal felt too much to bear. But slowly, things started to change. The village set up a support group for couples going through tough times. It was strange at first, sitting in a circle, sharing our stories, but there was comfort in knowing we weren't alone. One night, as I was walking home from a session, I ran into the teacher. We stood there under the stars, two men trying to rebuild their lives. "Did you ever think our story would turn out like this?" he asked. I shook my head, never in a million years. As I went to bed that night, I thought about how our little village had become a character in this story too. How it had gone from a place of judgment to one of support and healing. It wasn't perfect. There were still whispers, still doubts, but it felt like we were all part of something bigger, something important. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about forgiveness, about healing, about the power of community. This wasn't the happy ending I'd always imagined for my life. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the ending at all. Maybe it was the beginning of a new chapter, a new story. As I drifted off to sleep, I wondered what tomorrow would bring. In this real-life bedtime story, anything seemed possible. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. Just when I thought our story couldn't get any stranger, life threw us another curveball. It all started during one of our support group meetings. Old Margaret was there, listening to our stories, when suddenly her eyes went wide. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse, it's happening again." We all stared at her, confused. "Curse? What curse?" Margaret explained that every 100 years our village faced a test. Relationships would be strained by infidelity and betrayal. It wasn't just us, our ancestors had gone through the same thing. At first, I thought it was just another bedtime story, a way to make sense of our pain. But as Margaret shared more details, things started to click into place. The timing, the pattern of events, it all fit. "There's only one way to break the curse," Margaret said, her eyes gleaming. "The magical pendant of truth, hidden deep in the enchanted forest." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A curse? A magical pendant? It sounded like something out of a storybook. But after everything we'd been through, I was ready to believe anything if it meant fixing our relationships. So there we were. A strange group indeed. Me, my wife, the teacher, his wife, the baker, and a few other villagers, all setting off into the forest. The same people who'd been at each other's throats were now working together, united by a common goal. The forest was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Trees whispered secrets, shadows danced, and every step felt like a test. We faced challenges that forced us to confront our deepest fears and insecurities. I found myself paired with my wife for one task, having to cross a chasm by building a bridge together. As we worked, we talked, really talked, for the first time in months. I saw her vulnerability, her regret, and felt my anger slowly melting away. The teacher and his wife faced a different trial, navigating a maze that changed based on their emotions. They had to be honest about their feelings, their fears, their hopes. I watched as they rediscovered each other, seeing the love that had been buried under hurt and misunderstanding. Even the baker played his part, his skills crucial in solving a riddle that blocked our path. We all had to learn to trust each other, to work as a team despite our past conflicts. As we delved deeper into the forest, I realized this journey was changing us. The magic wasn't just in the pendant we sought, it was in the way we were healing, growing, forgiving. Finally, after what felt like days, time worked strangely in that forest, we found the pendant. It glowed with an otherworldly light, pulsing like a heartbeat. As we all touched it together, I felt a surge of energy, of understanding. In that moment, I saw our story for what it was. A test, yes, but also an opportunity. An opportunity to grow, to learn, to become better versions of ourselves. As we made our way back to the village, pendant in hand, I couldn't help but think about how this tale would be told in the future. Would it become another bedtime story, passed down through generations? One thing was certain. Our story wasn't over yet. We had broken the curse, but the real work was just beginning. As we emerged from the forest, changed and yet somehow more ourselves than ever, I realized that sometimes the most magical stories are the ones we live every day. As we returned to the village, pendant in hand, I felt like a different person. The curse was broken, but we all knew the real work was just beginning. It was time to face our relationships head-on, with all the newfound wisdom we'd gained. My wife and I sat down for a long, hard talk. We laughed, we cried, we yelled a bit too. But for the first time, I really listened. I saw her not as the person who had betrayed me, but as a human being with her own struggles and pain. When she took my hand and asked if we could try again, I found myself nodding. We decided to get a paternity test for our child. The wait was agonizing, but when the results came back confirming I was the father, it felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't an instant fix, mind you. Trust is like a delicate piece of furniture. Once broken, it takes time and patience to repair, but we were both committed to putting in the work. The teacher's situation was, well, unique. After much soul-searching and many heartfelt conversations, he, his wife, and the baker came to an understanding that worked for them. It wasn't conventional by any means, and it certainly raised a few eyebrows in the village. But seeing the peace and happiness on my friend's face, I knew they had found their own version of love and commitment. As for the village, our little adventure had sparked something. People started talking, really talking, about their relationships, their fears, their hopes. It was like the pendant had cast a spell of honesty over us all. We started a new tradition. Once a year, couples would come together to renew their commitments, not just to each other, but to open communication and understanding. It wasn't always easy. There were tears, arguments, and plenty of awkward moments. But there was also laughter, forgiveness, and a deeper sense of community than we'd ever had before. Old Margaret took to sharing our story with the younger generations. I'd often see her surrounded by wide-eyed children telling them about the curse, the forest, and the lessons we'd learned. Remember, she'd say, her eyes twinkling, the real magic isn't in some pendant, it's in here. And she'd point to her heart. As for me, well, life went on. My wife and I had our ups and downs, but we faced them together. Each night, as we tucked our child into bed, I'd think about the story of our village. It wasn't a typical happily ever after bedtime story. It was messy, complicated, and real. Years passed, and one evening I found myself sitting on my porch, much like I used to in the old days. But this time, instead of secrets and tension, there was peace. I watched as couples walked by, hand in hand, some with children, some without. Each with their own story, their own struggles, but all part of our village's bigger tale. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over our little community, I smiled to myself. Our story wasn't over, it never really would be. But now, instead of fearing what each new chapter might bring, I looked forward to it. Because I knew that whatever came our way, we'd face it together, with honesty, forgiveness, and love. And isn't that what every good story is about in the end? What do you think, guys? Write below.